Welcome back. In this video, I'll be covering Learning Objective 13.3 for PSY 235, Social Psychology. In this section of the chapter, you'll be looking at describing some ways that prejudice affects the people at whom it is focused. We'll begin by revisiting the concept, the self-fulfilling prophecy, which was explored in a much earlier chapter during the semester. Remember that the self-fulfilling prophecy is basically this social phenomenon where people have an expectation about what another person is supposed to be like, how they're expected to behave, what kind of traits they're likely to possess. That then shapes the way the individual with those expectations interacts with that person, and that pattern of behavior can actually elicit the expectations from the target individual. This graphic from your text illustrates the way some researchers demonstrated the self-fulfilling prophecy in the context of prejudice. So in the first study, they had a white interviewer who was shown to be treating job applicants differently during the interview in terms of things like sitting closer or farther away, using eye contact and other kinds of nonverbal communication cues that indicate distance or not liking the person. And when they found that the interviewer was sitting farther away, it was significantly more likely that the person they were sitting farther away from was of a different race from them. So applicants who were seated farther away from their interviewer, or when the interviewer chooses to sit farther away, doesn't use as much eye contact, uses body posture that indicates dislike or concern, that tends to elicit from the interviewee nervousness, an air of ineffectiveness, and they tend to behave in ways that suggest incompetency. If they were in front of a white job applicant, however, the white interviewer tended to sit closer, tended to make more eye contact, and tended to stay in the interviewer longer, asking more questions. In that case, what the interviewee is perceiving is indicators of friendliness, of warmth. So when someone sits closer to you, gives you their eyes, they look in your eyes, they ask you questions, they nod a lot, they use a lot of those soft signs of acceptance and interest, then you tend to respond in kind. So the applicant was showing signs of being poised, of being effective, being competent. So you can start to see the way in which the self-fulfilling prophecy might play itself out. In the second study, the interviewers were trained to use one of two styles of interview. Either they were to use a more distant style, so sitting far away, using a short interview, less eye contact, and so on. Or the second style was to sit closer and have a longer interview, use more of those soft signs of acceptance and warmth. And what they found was, even if you had two applicants who were both white, the one that the interviewers sat farther away from appeared to be more nervous, more ineffective, less competent, whereas those that the interviewer was trained to sit closer to and use more soft signs of acceptance tended to show greater signs of effectiveness and comfort and confidence and competence and so on. So that's a way in which researchers have demonstrated the effect of the self-fulfilling prophecy. At the societal level, the self-fulfilling prophecy goes a long way. If you have an entire kind of group of people that tends to be responded to by others in a specific way, so if teachers, for example, tend to respond to all children who are in a particular social group in the same way, it tends to pull those behaviors that are expected out of that group, whether they wanted to or not. The example given in your textbook is, suppose there's a general belief that a group is not very smart, isn't capable of being fully educated, and is only good for low-wage jobs and can only be trusted with such jobs. That belief is used to deny people access to equal schooling, and then 30 years later, what do you find? You have a whole group of people who meet those expectations of only being competent to do low-wage work. The real reason they're only able to do low-wage work is because they've been denied schooling, not because they were less intelligent, uneducable, they were more uneducable, or they were only fit for those kinds of jobs. That wasn't the reason. The reason was they were denied access to education. So the self-fulfilling prophecy tends to wrap back around on itself and say, see, we were right all along, that these are people who fit the beliefs that we have of them. What's really driving the difference is a more societal level discrimination that inadequately educates people. Researchers have also identified a really insidious effect. It's something called the social identity threat effect. And basically, the idea here is that people who have prejudice directed against them know that the prejudice is directed against them. And they also know what the specific beliefs and expectations of them are. So they may believe that they're expected to be underperformers at school. They may believe they're expected to be more likely to be troublemakers in school. Or out in the community, they're expected to perform worse at the workplace, and whatever you can think of. So that awareness that your group is the target of prejudicial attitudes and beliefs, stereotypes, just knowing what those are tends to put pressure on you to behave in ways that counter them. What that can produce is a whole bunch of anxiety and concern and even fear. So in the early research on this topic, which was done by Claude Steele and Joshua Aronson, they started with a sample of African American students who were in what the researchers called highly evaluative educational situations. In other words, they were given a high-stakes test. And what they found was that these students tended to experience a lot of nervousness and fear about conforming to the existing stereotype that African American students would be less intelligent, because that was a prevailing stereotypical assumption that was commonly held at the time the research was done. So, and you might be thinking, this must be way back in the day, like the 1950s. No, it was studied in the 1990s, late 80s, early 90s, on through the rest of the 1990s. So this wasn't the old days. Well, from your point of view, it might be, but it really wasn't. They also looked at stereotypes directed at female students, and this was a more interesting design to a study. They had a situation where female students were led to believe that a test that they were going to take was designed to demonstrate differences in abilities between males and females. When they were told that, when that was the instruction that they were given at the beginning, basically they sit down, they're handed their test, and they're told, this is a test that really shows the differences between males and females in terms of math performance. And then they have to take the test. The stereotype about female ability in math and science is that they're less capable, that males are wired for math, females are wired for language and communication. So the stereotype, knowledge of that stereotype, tends to elicit apprehension and fear. That apprehension is then argued by the researchers to cause a diminishment in performance. When women were told that the very same test, so it's the exact same metric, had nothing to do with male-female differences, the difference in performance actually evaporated. So that's how the researchers know that it was the expectation at the cultural level and the fear that they would live up to those expectations that was creating the problematic decrease in performance. When people believe that tests are not biased, they tend to perform equally. So again, when you look at this graphically, what was found in that second study, set of studies when they were looking at gender, if the participant was told there were no gender differences on a particular test, they tended to score equally. Even though this appears to be different, it's not a significant difference. When they were told that the test produces a gender difference, then women underperformed and men overperformed, magnifying the stereotypes about both groups, right? So what do we know about reducing stereotype threat? Because, it's one thing to demonstrate that it exists. It's another thing entirely to turn it on its head and make it go away. Understanding stereotype threat can help us to improve performance on a variety of kinds of assessments. What you can do, and these are really simple manipulations, and it really surprises researchers when they find these effects because they're such small manipulations, but all of the manipulations tend to reduce apprehension when we're being evaluated. So in one study, they reminded African American participants that they had gotten into a very selective school, meaning that the academic standards were really high. You got in, and then performance was pretty equal. Same thing happened with the gender gap on a spatial ability test, which is one of those areas within cognitive psychology that we have kind of a history of showing gender differences, with males outscoring females. When females are reminded that they have already been very excellent in their academics, that they were accepted to very restrictive school that only accepts the cream of the crop, then the gender differences disappear. Another thing that's been shown to be helpful or effective is the idea of self-affirmations, which to me, when I read about this research, I'm like, self-affirmations, that really can't do anything, can it? But it can. When people are brought into a testing situation and they are instructed to spend some time thinking about important social identities other than that are outside of that negative stereotype. So aspects of social identity that are strong, where their performance is high, where they outperform other people. So focusing your attention on the things that you do extremely well can actually negate some of the anxiety that people feel when they're performing in a stereotype domain. It can help to combat the feeling of being in a stigmatized group. And that concludes my coverage of Learning Objective 13.3.